This week's case is about a serial killer that tortured and killed 6 men between 1984 and 1987 in Kansas City, Missouri. So, let's get started. Hello everyone! For those that are new here, my name is Brandy, and every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of my fabulous felines. Black Phillip is here to say hello to everybody. Are you being pissy today? We're gonna be ornery today. Oh yeah. He goes back and forth whether he wants love or not. I do have Darth Kidius running around underneath me, attacking my foot. So she's a little wild right now. Yes, Darth Kidius. Mwah. She is now well enough and has been well enough that she's going to get her baby maker taken out soon. So yes, we don't want any unwanted animals because there's too many in the world right now, right? So, okay, there you go. Alright, kitty loving out of the way. Now, this week's case was recommended by a viewer named Space Case 0810, and the way it was presented to me was that this guy that we're talking about is a mix between John Wayne Gacy and Jeffrey Dahmer. So of course I had to check this out. Thank you, Space Case, for the recommendation. Now, this story has some messed up stuff in it. So we're going to be talking about some torture and some sexual assault. So, content warning! This video will definitely become demonetized on YouTube because of the content, so be sure to check out my merch shop. The link is in the description below, or you can become a member of this channel also. Alright, so Robert Andrew Berdella was born on January 31st, 1949 in Ohio. Now, Robert was the oldest son in the family, and he did have a brother who was 7 years younger than him. Now, his father, Robert Sr., worked in the Ford Motor Company, and his mom, Mary, was a homemaker. Hi, Peanut. Now, Robert's parents were very Catholic, and he was raised in a very religious household. So attending mass and attending, religious education courses was pretty much the norm for both of the boys. But as a child, Robert was very intelligent, but he was a loner. Now, Robert wore very thick glasses because he was very nearsighted, and that started at the age of 5. So he stayed inside a lot. He didn't really have a lot of friends, and he didn't socialize much. Now, he wasn't very athletic, and he was bullied in school. So this was very unlike his younger brother, who was athletic and was into sports and had friends and everything like that. Now, Robert's father was the type of person who put a lot of stock into, boys that played sports. He made that like a high importance in his boys' life. So Robert's father would look at Robert and thought he saw like a failure because Robert wasn't interested in that stuff, and he'd constantly compare Robert to his younger brother. Now, Robert's father was also known to be abusive. He'd use a leather strap to discipline them, and he would also emotionally abuse them by pitting them against each other. When Robert reached puberty, he started to realize that he was a homosexual. He kept this closely guarded as a secret because of his, family's religious beliefs, and his own, because, he did believe in this religion that he was raised in for a while. Now, in his early teens, he did have a girlfriend very briefly, but that just solidified the fact that he was attracted to males. Now, on Christmas Day in 1965, Robert would have been 16 years old. Robert's father had a heart attack and passed away. Now, despite how his father treated him during his childhood, Robert still loved his father. So he was, upset, and he actually turned to his religion to help find solace. What he found, though, is that his religion wasn't really giving him the solace he needed. So he started studying other religions as well. And the conclusion he came to is he became very cynical about religion in general and decided that religion really wasn't for him at all. Now, shortly after the death of his father, we're talking a couple months, his mother remarried. Now, Robert saw this as a complete betrayal against his father, and he was very upset with his mother. So Robert further immersed himself in solitary activities where he didn't really have to socialize, even with his family. He did things like painting, stamp collecting, coin collecting, and he would have several pen pals across the world. Now, around this time, Robert had gone to the movies, and he saw the movie The Collector. Now, for those of you who don't know what this movie is about a man who becomes obsessed with a woman, takes her captive, and keeps her in his basement as like a trophy type thing, or like a piece of art that he can, look at whenever he wants to. Now, despite his efforts to keep her alive, she ends up dying because she contracts an illness and just doesn't end well. Robert would later state that this movie actually had a profound effect on him, and especially about keeping the captive part. So 2 years later, in 1967, Robert graduated from high school, and then he enrolled in the Kansas City Art Institute. In his first year of college, he was a pretty normal student. By his second year of college, he'd become very outspoken, very confident, and he openly came out as gay. He started becoming anti-authoritarian as well, and started causing problems around the college. Now, Robert had himself kind of become an alcoholic, and he started selling drugs for money to his peers. He had also tortured animals in front of his peers. By the age of 19, Robert was arrested for selling drugs to an undercover officer. Now, he did post the bond, which back then was $3,000, and he was given a 5-year suspended jail sentence. 1 month later, he was arrested again for drug possession. Now, this time he could not pay his bond, and he spent 5 days in jail, but then the charges got dropped due to lack of evidence. So he was out free. Now, in 1969, Robert and the Kansas City Institute of Art would part ways. See, Robert had killed a duck and then cooked it in front of his class, and he said it was art. The college came down on him pretty hard. He voluntarily dropped out of the college. Now, Robert had kind of established himself in Kansas City, so he did decide to stay there, and he ended up moving into a house, and he continued to be open and honest about being gay. Now, Robert decided to get clean. He no longer drank, and he no longer did drugs, but he did spend a lot of time with male prostitutes, drug addicts, and some petty criminals, and he decided to actually try to help them get out of that life. So he would befriend these individuals, and he would even let them stay at his house, and he would help them, try to get a job and try to get out of either drugs or crime or the male prostitution. And he was seen as generally a good guy, and word of mouth had spread that if you actually, were ready to move along with your life, you can go see Robert and he would help you. However, by the 1980s, things sort of changed a little bit. Robert was getting frustrated that some of the young men that he was helping weren't trying themselves. They just were using him as a place to stay and would still participate in the life that they always did. Robert had also gotten frustrated that the younger men that he'd helped that have now gotten older and actually had changed and became a productive member of society, they had either moved away or they had just, kind of cut ties with Robert, and he felt that, they at least owed him a friendship. So overall, Robert was just getting frustrated all the way around. So Robert started kind of giving in to some of his urges. He started having sexual encounters with some of these people he was helping in order to try to have more control over them. Like, he would say, well, come have sex with me and you can live rent free, or come have sex with me and I will give you money. Now, to Robert's neighbors, they considered him, flamboyant. They knew he was gay, but at the same time, he was civic-minded. He was overall a good guy, helping these young men out. I mean, Robert was even on, he was the chair of the neighborhood crime prevention unit. He always represented his neighborhood when they were fundraising for things. So, and he stated he was almost like a foster dad to these young men. So they really saw him as an overall good guy, just helping people out and doing what he could for the community. Now, for money, Robert started off as a cook. And he worked in various restaurants around Kansas City. Due to his, various pen pals around the world, he was getting sent antiques and trinkets and just overall cool stuff. And he decided to start a business selling coins, stamps, antiques, stuff like that. By 1981, Robert established several contractual agreements, both nationally and internationally. So he was having all types of things coming into him that he was reselling. And by 1982, Robert had a store called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. He primarily sold primitive art, jewelry, and antiques from all around the world. And this is where he met his first victim, Jerry Howell. So Jerry Howell was the teenage son of a fellow merchant that Robert knew. And Jerry used to actually make fun of Robert because he was openly gay. Now, later, after kind of a friendship had formed, Jerry confided in Robert and stated that, to earn money, him and his friends sometimes did turn to male prostitution. Over the next year or so, the two became friends. Now, in 1984, Jerry was 19 years old, and he actually wanted a ride over to a neighboring town because they were having a dance contest that he wanted to participate in. So Robert agreed to drive Jerry over to that dance contest. However, once Jerry was in the car, he plied him with alcohol and Valium. And once Jerry was kind of good and relaxed and on the edge of unconsciousness, Robert ended up injecting Jerry with some heavy sedatives. He then went back home, took Jerry into his house, and tied Jerry to his bed. Over the next 28 hours, Robert would torture and sexually assault Jerry. He would even use foreign objects to sexually assault him. Now, according to Robert, after 28 hours, Jerry eventually asphyxiated on his own vomit, or was unable to catch his breath due to the drugs that Jerry was pumping into him. But in the end, Jerry passed away. So when Robert realized that Jerry was gone, he took Jerry's body to his basement, where he suspended his body over a large basin. He would cut major arteries of Jerry and pretty much drained him of all his blood. The next day, he then dismembered Jerry's body, put them all in sacks, and then put them on the curb for the garbage man to take to the landfill. Now, Jerry's dad did file a missing persons report, and Robert was asked about Jerry's disappearance. Robert said that he dropped him off at the dance contest and he hadn't seen him since. And that seemed to end that questioning. So in April of 1985, 20-year-old Robert Sheldon, who I'll call Sheldon so we don't get confused on who's who here, asked if he could stay at Robert's home for a short time. He needed help. He wanted off the streets. So Sheldon was paying rent, but Robert saw him as kind of an inconvenience because Sheldon didn't seem to be, again, helping himself. Now, one day Robert had come home from work and he found Sheldon in the house drunk. Well, this upset Robert because the whole point of helping him is getting him off this stuff. So Robert took Sheldon to the second floor bedroom, drugged him, and tied him to the bed. Robert held Sheldon for 3 days as a captive. Now, he did torture him, but Robert stated that he wasn't sexually attracted to Sheldon, so he did not sexually assault him. But the torture was terrible. He would pour drain cleaner in his eyes to blind him. He would fill Sheldon's ear with like caulking so he couldn't hear anything. And then he would stick like needles under his fingernails and other types of terrible torture. On the 3rd day of Sheldon's captivity, Robert had someone coming to actually work on the roof of his house, and the guy needed inside. Well, Robert did not want them to find Sheldon, so he decided to get rid of Sheldon, and he ended up suffocating Sheldon with a rope. He then would dismember Sheldon's body in the bathroom. He would then put the parts on the curb, but he did keep Sheldon's skull as a souvenir. So that following June, there was a storm going on, and Robert had gone out to his tool shed for something. He found a young man, Mark Wallace, who was actually taking shelter from the storm in his tool shed. Now, Robert did already know who Mark was because he had helped him prior, and of course Mark ran off and didn't want the help. But regardless, Robert told Mark to come inside. Now, Mark was either coming down off a drug high or whatever was wrong with him that he took, but he was very tense and anxious, and Robert had told him, look, I can't have you pacing around here, you're making me crazy, so let me give you something to calm you down. And Mark agreed. So Robert injected him with some heavy tranquilizers and he fell unconscious. And once he was unconscious, Robert tied him to the bed and made him his next captive. Now, Robert was kind of stepping up his game with the torture. Robert had made up this kind of car battery type thing where he would take clamps and clamp it to Mark and then electrocute him. So he did that. Then he would take several hypodermic needles and he would just insert them into various muscles in Mark's back and inject him with things. And at this time, Robert said that he was just experimenting with new types of torture. So obviously he didn't plan on stopping anytime soon. Now, because he stepped up his game on the torture, Mark actually did not even last a day. He lasted less than 24 hours and he had passed away, most likely due to the drugs that was being injected into him by the needles and the constant shocks he was getting. And Robert did the usual. He dismembered Mark and put his parts on the curb for the garbage man. The next victim was in September of 1985, and his name was James Ferris. Now, James asked to stay again at Robert's place. Robert knew him from helping him prior. Now, James was slightly different to Robert because as soon as James had called Robert and asked him for help, Robert knew right away that was his next victim. And for whatever reason, he decided he was really going to step up the torture with this guy. So, as usual, James come over, he drugged James, and he tied him to the bed. And then he used needles and almost did acupuncture to James's neck and genitals. Robert, of course, sexually assaulted James and did his various other things like shocking him and stuff. After 27 hours, James just stopped breathing. So Robert dismembered him, but this time he buried James in his backyard, or at least he buried James's head in the backyard, and then the rest of the body went on the curb. The fifth victim was 23-year-old Todd Stoops. Todd was a drug addict that Robert was familiar with because he had helped him in 1984, and Todd was married because both him and his wife stayed at Robert's house back in 1984 before they had left. Now, once Todd and his wife had left the house, Robert hadn't heard anything from them until he actually was walking in a park and Todd was asking people for money. Now, since Todd recognized Robert, he ran up to Robert and said, "I need some money for drugs." So obviously Todd had not changed his ways. Robert told him he'd make a deal with him. "Come back to the house for some sex and I'll give you some money." Now, Robert would say that of all the men that he was with, Todd was by far the most he was attracted to. He was very extremely attracted to Todd. So he kept Todd captive for 2 weeks. Now, the torture for Todd started out very mild, and most of the time he was just sexually assaulting Todd. But the torture would come in when Todd wasn't cooperative. So in order to keep Todd as a cooperative slave, he would threaten torture so Todd would do what Robert wanted. Now, during the sexual assaults and torture, sometimes Todd would make too much noise, and that would frustrate Robert. So Robert attempted to, one, make Todd blind by swabbing his eyes with drain cleaner and ammonia and other household products. And then he actually took drain cleaner and injected it into his larynx in order to try to destroy his voice box. Now, during the second week of Todd's captivity, Robert, this is like the worst, so prepare yourself. Robert ruptured the wall of Todd's anal cavity with his fist. This caused bleeding and discharge, and Todd died a couple days later from septic shock due to the injury. So Todd was then dismembered and put on the curb. Now, the sixth victim was 20-year-old Larry Pearson. Robert had created a friendship with Larry Pearson because Larry was coming into his shop a lot. Now, Larry ended up moving in with Robert because he had no place to go, and instead of paying rent, he did chores around the house. Now, Robert didn't actually have any intention of making Larry a captive, but Larry apparently was into petty crime, and he got caught one day and had called Robert and asked Robert to bail him out of jail. Well, this pissed Robert off. So as soon as he got home that night, he drugged Larry and then he'd taken him to the basement. Now, he strung Larry up with his hands like over his head and tortured him. Larry started begging that he would do anything to, stop this torture. And Robert would say that Larry ended up being his most compliant captive. So as a reward, he moved Larry from the basement to the upstairs and tied him to the bed, because so he was more comfortable. Now, he still tortured Larry and he sexually assaulted him, but at least the torture wasn't as bad as it was in the basement, apparently. Now, Larry was actually held captive for 6 weeks. And after those 6 weeks, something finally snapped in Larry. And while Robert was forcing Larry to perform oral sex on him, Larry bit down. And then he screamed at Robert and said he could no longer endure this torture. In order to, free himself, Robert ended up grabbing the nearest thing and knocking Larry on the head, which made him unconscious. Robert then suffocated Larry, and then he drove himself to the hospital to get treatment for his wound. When Robert returned that night, he dismembered Larry's body, he buried part of it in the backyard, and put the rest on the curb. Now, there was one more victim, but fortunately, this guy escaped. So in March of 1988, Robert lured a 22-year-old man named Christopher Bryan to his house and rendered him unconscious via the normal means. Christopher was tied to the bed and tortured and sexually assaulted just like the others. Now, Christopher was pretty cooperative. And Robert actually began to trust Christopher pretty quickly, like within 2 days. But he did warn Christopher. He stated, and I quote, "I've gotten this far with other people before, and they are dead now because of mistakes they made." Now, Robert trusted Christopher enough that when he'd tie his hands, most people were tied with their hands above their head to the bed. But Christopher was able to get his hands tied in front of him, so he was able to actually watch TV with a remote and everything like that while Robert was at work. On the 4th day of Christopher's captivity, Robert had gone to work, and Christopher noticed that on the, side table by the bed, Robert had inadvertently left some matches. So Christopher was able, because his hands were tied in front of him, were able to grab the matches and burn through his rope restraints. He then jumped out of the 2nd-story window, breaking his ankle in the process, and then ran across the street to a nearby meter maid that was walking the street. Now, Christopher had nothing on but a dog collar, so this, of course, shocked everyone, and the meter maid did call the police. So police arrived, got Christopher help and for any of his injuries, because, he had been tortured like the others, the swabbing of the ammonia in the eyes, needles, being shocked, all that stuff. So they got him to the hospital, and then they questioned him. Now, Christopher told the police of his captivity, the torture, the sexual assaults, all that stuff, and that Robert had actually talked of other victims, and that he even had Polaroid pictures of these victims and had told Christopher that these men were now dead. So the police had surveyed the house for the remainder of the day, and when Robert got home from work, they pounced. Now, at first, Robert answered the door and he would not let the police inside, but they had a warrant, so Robert had no choice. Upon searching the property, they found, various torture devices, the car battery shock thing, ropes, syringes, bottles of drugs, both like in liquid form and pill form. In the closet, they found a human skull, which was Sheldon's, and several human teeth and bits of skin, like saved in an envelope. Now, searching the backyard, they found the partially decomposed head and several other various body parts of the 2 men he put back there. But Robert's true genius, I say that sarcastically, was when they found his notebook that contained very detailed information of all his crimes. Police would find 334 photographs, Polaroid photographs of various stages of torture that he did to these men, and 34 of those photographs were actually pictures of where he put body parts in and around the house. And placed neatly on top of the dresser in his room was the famous notebook, which contained the details of everything he did to these men. It started with the date of the capture and what he did and what drugs he gave them to render them unconscious. He then detailed the torture he did to them, the sexual assaults he did to them, any drugs he injected into them during this torture. It even went to show that he had antibiotics. In order to keep some of the victims alive longer, he would treat them with antibiotics and such. And then finally, the date of their death. Thanks, Robert. That makes things so much easier in the investigation. Now, people did make, missing persons reports for some of these men, and specifically there was missing reports made on Jerry Howe, which was the first victim, and James Ferris. And Robert was considered the main suspect for both of these men's disappearances. But police were never able to find solid evidence to link the disappearances to Robert, so they never could do anything about it. But now that they had Christopher and a witness that was alive, Robert was initially charged with sexually assault and keeping Christopher captive, and then the charges just kept getting added on as they searched the property and found all this evidence. Now, when they questioned Robert, Robert would confess to keeping Christopher captive and sexually assaulting him, and he did confess to one of the murders. He would plead not guilty to the other 5 murders. But once they presented Robert with all the evidence of, these other 5 murders, Robert decided that a plea deal was probably his best option to avoid the death penalty. So, the plea deal agreement was that Robert would confess to all the murders, including keeping Christopher captive, and in graphic detail would tell them what he did to each and every man, and then what he did with the bodies. In return, Robert would get a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Now, Robert stated overall that the reason he kept these guys captive and that he tortured them like he did is because he was so frustrated that they weren't improving their lives, that he felt like he put so much effort in trying to help them and they never helped themselves. Now, in the end, Robert was convicted of torturing and killing 6 men and torturing a 7th, but police believe that Robert was involved in 2 other disappearances as well. Now, Robert has stayed adamant that he had only killed those 6 men and kept Christopher captive with the intent to eventually kill him. And if he would have had anything to do with those other 2 men, he would have put it in his notebook. Now, although some of the men's body parts were found, not all were. Robert admitted that most of the body parts were taken away by the garbage man and ended up in a landfill somewhere. So, unfortunately, those parts were never recovered. After Robert's incarceration, he did some interviews behind bars where he seemed to care very much about how the public felt about him. So he wanted to tell people that, he was still a good man. He just simply made some mistakes. He then went on to lodge complaints about the prison conditions, and he complained to some judges and some other therapists that he was on meds for his heart condition and high blood pressure, and the prison wasn't giving him his meds, apparently. On October 8th, 1992, Robert complained to prison staff that his chest was feeling tight and he had some pains. He ended up passing away 2 hours later of a heart attack. He was 43 years old. When the judge that oversaw his trial was informed about Robert's passing, the judge stated, "Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy." So my only question in this case is, if Robert was the prime suspect in not 1 but 2 disappearances, why didn't they get a warrant to search his house back then? I mean, they would have most likely found evidence because it appears he kept a lot of souvenirs. Now, I did find where Robert's lawyer had actually wrote letters to the police department telling them to cease and desist and questioning Robert on these disappearances, or he was going to file harassment charges. But again, when does that work? But I guess it worked back then, so. But I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. If you'd like to become a feline friend, simply hit that subscribe button. If you'd like to become a feline fan, hit that join button for special perks. And a free way to help me out is to hit that like button. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you next week with another case.